school, Jefferson County Traditional Middle School, lies in the heart of the Highlands and the Louisville area. The Highlands was the center of a very important historical movement in the development of Americana music. In the 70s, to be more exact, the evolution of the bluegrass music, known more popular as Newgrass. All this took place in the neighborhood, where I stand now, known as the Mid-City Mall, back then was more commonly known as the Storefront Congregation. This is a place where some young musicians played weekly. Olive went on to become major musical celebrities. Back then they were just young, poor, very talented kids, but each was beginning a musical journey that leads them into stardom in their careers. People like Jerry Douglas, Ricky Skaggs, Sam Bush, Tony Rice, and Vince Gill. These are all only a few creating a new style of bluegrass music. We will visit the home of Harry Bickle. His house became known as the Bluegrass Hotel. After buying the house in 1975, he let some of these musicians stay at his house. He was literally nurturing the next generation of bluegrass musicians by helping them out before they became famous. We will take a look at the lives and careers of some of these amazing musicians, all of whom were playing music in the Highlands in the 70s, forging a new sound for bluegrass and destined to be among the most influential acoustic bluegrass players of their generation. Join the STLP students of JCTMS as we investigate and celebrate this musical phenomenon that happened here in the Highlands of Louisville some 40 years ago. Enjoy!
J.D. Crowe was born in Lexington, Kentucky on August 27, 1937. When he was just 13, he picked up the banjo, inspired by a performance by Flatt and Scruggs' performance on the Kentucky Barn Dance. Crowe was soon playing with many groups across the Kentucky area. He was frequently playing on the radio, and when Jimmy Martin heard his playing, he joined his band. Later, he formed his own band called the Kentucky Mountain Boys. It was in the early 70s, after this band broke up, that he formed a new band called the New South, which was the most revolutionary band of its time. Playing and living in Louisville, the original band numbers, guitarist Tony Rice, mandolin player Ricky Skaggs, dobro player Jerry Douglas, were all destined to follow legendary careers of their own. As a band leader, J.D. Crowe was said by many of these other talented musicians to be very influential in developing their sense of rhythm and timing. One of the places they played was the Holiday Inn in Lexington and the Storefront Congregation in Louisville.
Jerry Douglas is probably the most influential and famous dobro player in the world today. In the early 70s in Louisville's Highlands, he was one of an unusually talented group of young bluegrass musicians. They were creating a new form of music called Newgrass, out of the more traditional bluegrass music that was created by Bill Monroe. When you listen to bluegrass dobro music today, you're basically hearing a style invented by Jerry Douglas, much like the way in which Earl Scruggs developed a signature / new style of banjo playing that came to be known as the way banjo was played in bluegrass music. This amazing style of musicians who were living in the Highlands in the 70s included now famous names like Ricky Skaggs, Tony Rice, Vince Gill, J.D. Crowe, Dan Crary, and Sam Bush, legends of today's bluegrass world.
Ricky Skaggs was one of the most famous musicians who lived in the Highlands of Louisville in the 70s. He was a major influence in the development of Newgrass music during that time. Ricky gained a reputation for his unusual level of talent through live appearances and recordings with bands like J.D. Crowe and the New South. He performed on his band's 1975 album For Rander Records, which is widely regarded as one of the most influential bluegrass albums ever made. This recording is famously known by its rounder number 0044. For a time, he formed his own band, Boone Creek. This was all before he became famous as a national country artist with songs like Highway 40 Blues and Country Boy. Later, he returned to his roots, where he remains today with his band Kentucky Thunder.
This is a lead-in to a tune that was created by Tony Rice, that we see in the background, one of the more famous Newgrass, progressive bluegrass guitarist that was living here in the neighborhood in the 70s. And that particular lick I learned off of the very famous recording by J.D. Crowe in the New South called Rounder 0044. And it's a lead-off to a tune called 10 Degrees and Colder by Gordon Lightfoot that they recorded.
So I noticed you're not using a pick. Is that how most Newgrass bluegrass bands do it? Or?
No, it's not the standard way, but maybe it's in the spirit of Newgrass in that Newgrass music was revolutionary, it was experimental, it was trying to break new ground in the bluegrass world, and that's definitely what I'm doing with an alternate way of getting at some of these things.
You say break new ground. How exactly did they do that?
Well, this particular piece, in one sense, is a folk song. It's a Gordon Lightfoot folk song, which is part of one of the stylistic things that was moving bluegrass in a more progressive direction. They were looking at different sources of music, rockabilly and folk music, and recording and bluegrassizing some of those types of things. So, as a Gordon Lightfoot song, that automatically made it something different than what Bill Monroe was doing. Technically, for a musician, from a musical standpoint, one of the things that is different about Newgrass from bluegrass are alternate chord voicings. So, for example, in the part of this that slides up, that chord, that's a very Tony Rice-like progressive kind of chord for bluegrass. But it still leads into the tonic chord that it normally would have anyway. So those are some of the kinds of things that sort of distinguish that lead-in that Tony created for 10 Degrees and Colder as Newgrass and more progressive than the older traditional bluegrass style.
What were some of the musicians that started this change into Newgrass?
Well, as far as guitarists go, and with the Bluegrass Alliance, Newgrass Revival, and Storefront Congregation, Tony Rice was one of them. Dan Crary was another one. And Jack Lawrence, the famous sideman for Doc Watson for many, many decades, was at one time involved here. And they're all great virtuoso guitarists who were filling that slot in one of those bands at that time.
You mentioned the Storefront Congregation. Were you actually alive when you could actually go and see?
I was, and I was also involved in music actually in this neighborhood. But it was all at that time for me in the realm of classical guitar. And so I was in the neighborhood, but very unaware of all of the things that were going on that would be very exciting for me now. I wish I'd known more about what was going on at the time.
Could you expand on that? You say what was going on, but what was going on?
Well, what was going on for me was the Louisville Classical Guitar Society was very active, and I was involved in that with a gentleman who lived here in the Highlands. We would get together. We actually formed a duo playing classical guitar, but at that same time overlapping, Tony Rice, Dan Crary, and Sam Bush, and Jerry Douglas, and some of these progressive bluegrass players were active in a different musical circle of activity in the same area. I just wasn't into that at the time and wasn't aware of it.
So we have Tony Rice on the background. Why would you pick him for this?
Well, as you may remember from our trip to visit Mr. Bickle, when Tony came, he already knew how to play, and he was already teaching other people some of his concepts about how to play guitar. So he was already influential, even in that time when these guys were young and first learning their chops. He was really, in terms of progressive bluegrass music, he was really one of the most influential in the whole movement.
So do you have anything else to play for us?
That really is the most representative thing um, that really represents a piece of Tony Rice type arrangement that I think is Newgrass, you know, for all of the reasons that we talked about.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Here we are at the home of Harry Bickle, known historically as the Bluegrass Hotel. The spot where we're standing has seen many very now famous celebrities come and go. Ricky Skaggs, Sam Bush, Jerry Douglas, among many others. And we're going to visit Mr. Bickle, ask him some questions, and get a tour of this musically historic home.
So, Mr. Bickle, what got you interested in music?
I grew up in the 60s, and there was a movement they called the folk movement back then, and I wasn't really interested in music, and my sister, who was older, had bought some Kingston Trio albums, and I started listening to them, and so I just didn't give them back to her. I kept the Kingston Trio albums, and at that time, and there were bands starting in our high school had a band, a folk band, and concerts were coming through. Peter, Paul, and Mary, groups like Peter, Paul, and Mary, Joan Baez, people like that were coming here to town to give concerts, and I fell in love with folk music. Then I picked up an Earl Scruggs album, Flatt and Scruggs album, and you know, I just fell in love with Earl's banjo playing. I decided to play banjo because I have fairly small hands, and you know, I thought it would be easier. Actually, it's no big deal. You know, you can play guitar with small hands as well as a banjo. But I really got interested in banjo. So,
How did you first meet some of these celebrities that stayed at your house?
well, part of it is just being there. You got to get out and do, you know, a lot of stuff. I started playing music in '63. By 1965, a friend of mine, I had just graduated high school. Actually, that was after my first year of college. A friend of mine and I borrowed his car, his dad's car, and drove to the Newport Folk Festival and saw a bunch of incredible musicians. Next year, drove to Virginia, saw one of the first bluegrass festivals ever held, and started getting into it like that. Meeting the people, though, was interesting. I did musical instrument repair work here. When I was in high school, I started learning from a man named Tom Hale. And Tom taught me how to do this, you know, the pearl inlay work on instrument necks. J.D. Crowe, who I didn't even know who J.D. was at this time, was coming to town to have a neck made, a banjo neck made. And so Tom called me and said, hey, you got to come over here and hear this guy. And of course, it just blew my socks off almost. He was so good. And he asked me how much it was going to cost to have the banjo neck inlaid. And I asked him if he gave lessons. And he said, yeah, I'll give you lessons. So I started taking banjo lessons from J.D. Crowe, who today is, you know, considered, you know, absolutely one of the tops banjo players. So and once you've met somebody like that, then you meet other people. I met Art Stamper, a fellow I recorded with for years. I met him, JD's, I met, you know, that's where I met so many of these guys. And you meet people playing, you know, when you have your own band, so.
So, out of everybody who stayed here, which one did you think would definitely lead to stardom?
I think Vince Gill. I think we all knew that Vince, we didn't know exactly what course he was going to take. He was 18 and 19 when he lived here. He'd never lived away from home before. Super kid, super, just lots of fun. He and I talked about it. You know, I asked him one time, I said, what's going to happen if you don't make it in music? And he was going to go into professional golf. He loves to play golf, and he's an excellent golfer. And, but, you know, he left here, I mean, we all knew that he was just as good as it gets. And he had, not only was he instrumentally good, which most musicians care more about their instrument than the voice, okay? But Vince had this glorious voice, like he says, I sing like a girl. So, you know, we knew he was gonna be big time. We just didn't know what direction. He moved out to California, he played with a band out there, then he played with Emmylou Harris, came back to Nashville. Took him a while, and once he had his hit song, that was it.
So if you had to explain the difference in bluegrass and newgrass, what would it be?
Bluegrass and newgrass. Well, bluegrass, particularly back in the 60s and the 70s, see, bluegrass started with Bill Monroe's band in the 1940s. Which I always say, you know, bluegrass is actually younger than I am, because it started at the end of 1945, about 3 months after I was born. But it's, at that time, bluegrass was what Bill Monroe defined it as, a certain type of instrumentation and so forth. When Newgrass started, they started using non-traditional styles of playing, and they started bringing other forms of music into it. One of the main ones was rock and roll. Sam Bush was, you know, was instrumental in bringing in, you know, Sam plays rock music, he plays blues, he plays anything, basically. And so it started, I remember probably the one song I remember most of Newgrass Revival when they first started was they did a song, a Jerry Lee Lewis song called Great Balls of Fire. And I mean, they just came out and just, it was unbelievable. And so they played a lot of that, they played a lot of jazz and so forth. It's a jazzier, more progressive way of playing bluegrass, usually though with the same sorts of instruments.
About how many people would you say were at the storefront congregation on an average night?
Wow. I don't even know how many people it held. Let me think. I mean, there were some nights, you know, where the band outnumbered the audience, I guess. But it was such a hangout. At one time, when I was playing there, my band was the Friday night band. Newgrass was the Thursday and the Saturday night band, and Tim Krekel's band was the Wednesday night band. So we tended to all hang out when the other groups were playing. So, you know, the place was always filled with musicians. And I'd say easily 100 people, maybe, you know. Sometimes they had, like Ralph Stanley's band came through there and played, and some other, you know, the Goins Brothers and folks like that played. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
How did these musicals that stay at your house practice for hours and hours to get so good?
How did they practice? Various ways. You know, one of the ways you get good playing music is to play with other musicians. And I guess it's like tennis. You always ought to play with somebody that's better than you. But, you know, when you've got a group of really good musicians, then it's easier because as you're playing and having fun, you're also practicing. But lots of guys would sit around. I remember one of them, a banjo player, used to sit upstairs for, sometimes he'd sit all day for days, and with a set of headphones on, playing with records or tapes. You know, he'd have them in the stereo, and he would be, you know, he'd have his banjo tuned up, and he'd be playing, learning licks, listening to other musicians, and playing. I remember, this was funny, but one weekend, I didn't have anything to do, so I decided I was going to spend the whole weekend practicing. And I kind of added up my hours, how much I actually spent that weekend. I spent 27 hours practicing. You know, just you get into it and you start practicing. But that's something that a lot of a lot of folks don't understand. They go take music lessons. They want to learn to play an instrument, but it takes incredible amount of time at some point. Now, some musicians, it takes less time. Some musicians pick it up faster than others. But it does take a tremendous amount of time of learning the techniques of your instrument.
Okay, what do you call about Tony Rice?
What do I call about Tony Rice? Well, very nice guy. Very, very talented. Very skinny, too. He was a very skinny man. I never was much, but Tony was. Actually, at one point I was about as skinny as Tony, but Tony was a knockout musician when he died. I mean, he didn't come here and learn a bunch of stuff. He knew a bunch of stuff and started teaching other people. I mean, he was just so good. I still love to watch Tony play. I love to watch his left hand. He has a left hand that moves across the strings, just like the fingers aren't even attached. He's just got one of the best left hands I've ever seen. But like I said, he was an excellent singer. When he got here, he wrote some songs. Unfortunately, Tony has lost his voice. He cannot hardly sing anymore. He damaged his vocal cords somehow, and so hopefully they're going to get better. But he's struggled with it for years. But he's just incredible musician. Then he left here and went out to the West Coast and started playing with David Grisman and started playing more jazzy type stuff. But yeah, Tony was just a fantastic musician from the time. And he was a lot of fun to be around too. He was kind of carefree, and most of those guys were pretty happy-go-lucky when they're at that age. So.
Okay, what can you tell us about Sam Bush?
Sam Bush. First time I saw Sam Bush was at the Roanoke Bluegrass Festival in 1966. He was 14. Richard Green, who was playing fiddle with Bill Monroe's band, introduced him. He came out. He had him come out and play a song in a workshop. Richard forgot his name, and I always still tease Sam about that. And then he finally said, "Oh yeah, here he is, little Sammy Bush from Bowling Green, Kentucky." And so Sam got out there and he played a fiddle tune that just, was really good. Sam revolutionized mandolin playing, and he started in it when he was a teenager. Nobody had played a mandolin like Sam played it. It's just this intensity. Monroe was a great mandolin player, Bill Monroe, and everybody started by basing their music on Bill Monroe's, but the newer generation of mandolin players basically have copied Sam. Sam was just a super musician. Somebody told me one time in Bowling Green he picked up an electric guitar, and within 2 months he was better than anybody in town. And Sam is one of these people that can't get enough of different types of music. He just, any kind of music he wants to listen to, and he can play any type of music. But he's a very intense, powerful mandolin player, and fiddle player, and guitar player, and banjo player, and he can play whatever he wants. But most people, he's mostly known for his mandolin playing and his fiddle playing.
How did you first meet Ricky Skaggs?
How did I first meet Ricky Skaggs? Actually, my band was playing at the Storefront congregation. It was called the Ohio River Valley Boys, except we had a girl in it too. And I was playing bass with the band, and it was on a Friday night. Ralph Stanley's band, Ralph Stanley and the Clinch Mountain Boys, were booked there on that night, on that Friday night. And so what they decided to do was have us play a set, and then we were going to play like their breaks. When the Clinch Mountain Boys went on break, my band was going to play. Well, that band contained Ricky Skaggs and Keith Whitley. They were both 16, 17 years old, and fantastic musicians already. As it turns out, their bass player, Jack Cook, couldn't get there. He was in Virginia and there was floods and he couldn't get through. So Ralph, I'd known Ralph for several years, so he asked me if I would play bass with his band. So I did. I just didn't get off the stage that night. I played bass with my band, and then I played bass with their band, and I played bass with my band, and then their band, so I was tired at the end of the night. So that's how I met Ricky, though. So.
What can you tell me about some of the other famous musicians who stayed at your house?
Well, of course, everybody knows about Vince. And Vince lived, actually, there's musicians that stayed here, there's musicians that lived here, and there's musicians that just came and played. Some other ones, John Hartford was here on numerous occasions, and John died probably 6 or 7 years ago. Fantastic musician, fantastic songwriter. He wrote Gentle on My Mind, a song you may or may not have heard, but a number of years after he wrote the song, it was the most played song in history. Okay, it played. You couldn't get on an elevator, walk through a mall. You couldn't go anywhere where they weren't playing that song. John told me one time that after he wrote that song, he never had to work again. He made so much money on royalties off of that song that he could just do what he wanted the rest of his life. So, you know, he toured, he had musicians with him, he had, you know, his own bus, and he just did what he wanted to do. J.D. Crowe, J.D.'s been here a number of times. He, just a fantastic musician, banjo player. He's one of the old school banjo players. He was playing actively in the 1950s. Sam Bush, you know who Sam Bush is, with the Newgrass Revival. Sam played here a lot. Didn't live here, but he played here and stayed here some. Tony Williamson, fantastic mandolin player. Keith Whitley, Bela Fleck. I could just keep naming them, but there, you know, just a lot of guys. Once you got a core group of musicians, you know, people come and hang out and play.
Okay. What was a typical week like at the storefront congregation?
Typical week? Well, let's see. I think they started, they opened up on about Tuesday. They were closed like maybe Sunday and Monday. I'm not sure about Sunday. And then there would be local bands on Tuesday, then Wednesday. Tim Krekel's band would play. Now this was during one time period. Tim Krekel's band would play. They were a rock band. They were called Dusty. They would play Beatles stuff. They would play all kinds of rock and roll stuff. Tim died about 2 years ago, I think. He went on to play with Jimmy Buffett and some other, you know, big acts. Then that was Wednesday night. Thursday night, at one point the Bluegrass Alliance was playing there every Thursday night, and then when Newgrass Revival started, they played on Thursday night. Then my band played on Friday night, and then Newgrass played on Saturday night, or Bluegrass Alliance. And then that went on for a year or two, and then after that it was just various local bands playing, and sometimes touring bands coming through. And they had they had old whiskey barrels you could sit on in front of the bar, and they had tables, and you drank beer or soft drinks out of a mason jar. So, in fact, at one time that was called the mason jar too. So.
Dan Curry is a music legend and a master of flat-picking acoustic guitar. If there was a Mount Rushmore for the forefathers of guitar picking, Dan Curry would definitely be on it. Along with Tony Rice, Doc Watson, Norman Blake, and Clarence White. Wouldn't I love to see that? Dan was one of the most influential guitarists in taking guitar playing out of the closet of being largely rhythm instrument and propelling it to the foreground as a dynamic soloing instrument. A native of Kansas, his childhood interest in the guitar turned serious during Dan's early years in the late 1950s. In those days, he says the guitar was far less prominent than it is today, even to the point that for the first 3 years he played, he knew no one else that did. Scary. In 1968, he helped form the progressive bluegrass band, the Bluegrass Alliance, here in Louisville, Kentucky, and was instrumental in helping forge a new sound, both in the way bluegrass acoustic guitar was used and the styles of music that his band began to incorporate. They incorporated rock, contemporary folk, and pop music, which was now beginning to be heard in the bluegrass styles on bluegrass instruments. We were lucky enough to get a phone interview from Mr. Crary to speak with us from all the way from California and share some of his early experiences in the highlands of Louisville as he helped to create a new and historic important evolution in Americana acoustic music. Thank you.
Hi, Mr. Curry.
Hi.
Can you tell us a little bit about how you got started in the Bluegrass Alliance?
Well, the way I got started in the Bluegrass Alliance was that I started playing the guitar when I was about 12 years old, and way back in about 1951 and 52, I guess. And for many years, I was the only guitar player I knew. I don't know if you guys can imagine this, but when I was sort of your age, it was very unusual for people to play guitar as much. I mean, they were doing it, but they were sort of background to country music and not much else, actually. And so for 3 years, I was the only guitar player I knew as a kid. Well, so, and I also started listening to bluegrass music at that age, and I heard it on the radio, but there was no bluegrass music around me. I came to Louisville to go to Southern Seminary, and but to tell you the truth, the thing that I really wanted to be doing, this is what I thought I was supposed to be doing. You know, I thought I was supposed to go to school and go into a helping profession and do all of that. But what I really wanted to do was I wanted to be playing music, but I thought, oh no, that's not important enough, you know. So while I was there in Louisville, I was going to Southern Seminary, and I was working at WINN radio station. I don't know if it's still there or not. And a guy that I knew, that I met, came to me and said, uh-oh, Dan, listen, there's going to be a new club open up in Louisville. They want a bluegrass band, and I think we should get up a band and audition for it. And so I was supposed to say no to that, but I didn't. I said, well, okay, let's go do that. So we went down and auditioned and got the job. Even though we only knew 5 songs together, we had to learn a bunch of songs very fast. So that's kind of how we got started. What do you already know about Newgrass music?
The vocals are a lot less high squeaky, I guess you could say, and there's more solos in all the instruments.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, okay, well, Newgrass was a phenomenon that came out of bluegrass music, so let me give you that, and then I'll tell you how we got into that. Bluegrass music was invented by some country musicians in the late 1940s. Some guys, including Bill Monroe and Lester Flatt and Earl Scruggs and Chubby Wise. It was Bill Monroe and the Bluegrass Boys was the name of that band. When they got together, they had a particular kind of sound that we identify now as the standard bluegrass sound. In the 1960s, some people like the Country Gentlemen, which were a band in Washington, D.C., and us, the Bluegrass Alliance, and a few other bands, instead of playing the traditional stuff of bluegrass music, which was sort of mountain music, old folk songs from the Appalachians, country music themes, and so on, we got the vision to push bluegrass a little bit further and to play some contemporary tunes that were that were being played by rock and roll players. And just like you said, it involved a little different kind of singing and extended instrumental breaks. I mean, bluegrass had always had instrumental breaks, but Newgrass loved long instrumental breaks and a real heavy influence of rock and roll, but still on bluegrass and acoustic instruments. So again, just to sum up, Newgrass was bluegrass, but it was bluegrass instruments and singing that was directed at some new ideas that the old bluegrass bands had not used, and some of those ideas were coming from pop music and rock day and he said, I figured out what to call this. I'm going to call it Newgrass. So Harry Sheeler figured out the word Newgrass, and it stuck, and it came to represent that kind of combination of the old music and the new, hipper music, to use a good old 60s term, sort of put together in a combination or a fusion. How's that? Is that a good answer?
Yeah. Tony Rice was another important guitarist who lived and was involved of the development of the Newgrass styles. How would you compare your style to his?
But you know what I really think about that is, I think that it is for other people to describe what I do. That's for the critics and the people who react to your music. And so it's hard to put a style into words, if you see what I mean. On the other hand, I will say this, that Tony Rice is unique among guitar players I know in that his style came to define an entire genre of music. There are a lot of great flat pickers around, and there are some people who've done a lot of records, and I consider myself a sort of veteran of the game, and I will tell you sort of where I fit into that early day, but nobody has had a greater stylistic influence than Tony has. I mean, his music grabbed the bluegrass people so hard and shook them. So everything in bluegrass music is kind of defined in part by the work that he did. Now, of course, there were other great flat pickers that came slightly before Tony Rice. There was Clarence White, for example, and there was George Shuffler, who played in the late 1950s with the Stanley Brothers. Clarence White was mostly a California phenomenon, and he played with California bluegrass bands before he became part of the band The Byrds in the 60s. And then I sort of came along in the late 1960s, and then when I left the band to go back to graduate school, Tony came to town and became part of the Bluegrass Alliance as well. So where I fit into this in the bluegrass stuff is that when the Bluegrass Alliance, that band that Harry Sheeler and I formed in 1968 there in Louisville, when we played at our first festival the following year in 1969, there had been lots of great flat picking around, but there wasn't any to speak of at this festival, and so there was no band at this national festival that had a flat picking guitar player who played breaks in all the songs. Now, there was a great flat picker there. His name was Larry Sparks, who played with Ralph Stanley, but Ralph Stanley did not have Larry play all the time. Just once in a while he would play a break, and Larry was a really good player, and so it was great when he did. And once in a while, the band, the Country Gentlemen, would have their guitar guy, whose name was Charlie Waller. Once in a while, he would play a break. But we were the only band at that festival in 1969, where the guitar played all the time as a solo instrument and as a rhythm instrument. So, in a way, I think what our band did, what I and the Bluegrass Alliance did, was to remind people that flat picking could be in bluegrass, even though people had done it before we did. It seemed like our going to that festival caught people's attention, and we sort of reminded people of the possibilities. And then Tony came along and did his great work. And I won't compare it stylistically, but I will say that on the few opportunities that I've had to sit on a stage with Tony Rice, with Doc Watson, with Norman Blake, another great flat picker of the time, the hardest job I had was not to just pay attention to what they were doing. I had to, because I was so interested in what they were doing, it was hard for me to take my eyes off of them. And when it was my turn to actually play something. But that was an amazing experience to be with those guys, and I'm honored to be sort of on the same page in the work that they did.
So, Kentucky is known for its mountain music, But today, we don't really know much about bluegrass or newgrass. What suggestions would you give to middle school students to help spread our past culture around?
That's a very good, a very interesting question. Let's see. I'm trying to think of how I started listening to bluegrass. So I'll go back to when I was your age, which I remember quite well. Kids get caught up, it seems to me that kids get caught up in the culture of the time, you know. And so you say that the kids of your generation don't know much about mountain music and bluegrass, okay? But I will bet this, I'll bet that you guys know a lot about some kind of music. Am I right about that?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Oh, and it would be the same artist. And so when you and your friends get together and have lunch and you talk about a new CD you bought or something cool that you downloaded, if you named the artist that you downloaded, your friends at the lunch table would know who that was, right?
Not for me.
No? Oh, okay. But would that be typically true?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, so young people have pop artists that they like to dance to or they like to listen to or they like to share with their friends and so forth. The way I think you discover alternative music, and bluegrass is an alternative music for you guys, and maybe you have other kinds of alternative music. Maybe some of you like jazz. Maybe you like classic rock. Maybe you like folk music, for example. Maybe some of you like some kind of foreign music. You know, maybe you like bossa nova or something like that. I think the way that people discover these alternative kinds of music is that they're fooling around, like on the radio, maybe, or they stumble onto something on TV that catches their attention and they hear it and they say, oh, that sounds really cool. When I was a little kid, a little bit younger than you were, I started just listening to the radio looking for something because my folks listened to like opera and classical music, which was good, but I was wanting to hear something else. And when I heard bluegrass, I heard it because I stumbled onto it by just fooling around and looking for different kinds of music. So what I would suggest to you guys, if you want to make your life more interesting, you want to introduce something beautiful into your life, is just become the kind of person who is not stuck only in the popular culture of the time. You know, that's cool to be in the popular culture of your era, but also look around for the things that might be out there on the fringe and just subject yourself however you can, you know, with your computers or on the radio or whatever, to listening to some kind of music that you haven't heard before and see if you like it. Because music, it's partly people choose their favorite kind of music, but here's another truth. The other truth is that the music chooses you. And there was no reason why I would like bluegrass when I heard it on the radio, because there was no bluegrass in my background. My folks didn't listen to country music. But when I heard bluegrass music in about 1951, I was knocked out by it, man. I was on the floor from the shock of how cool it was. And nobody of my friends liked it. And that was a case of the music chose me. And so I invite you guys to have a really interesting adventure, which would be to go out and listen to some kinds of music that you never listened to and see if any of you get chosen by that music.
I think that would be a wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Query.
Well, we've just finished a major project, many times having shot on location, discovering about the roots of Kentucky music and how important this neighborhood was in the development of taking bluegrass music and evolving it into a new form of Americana music called Newgrass. How did this project and this experience affect you all? And just let's get some feedback from you about how it affected you.
Well, I've always wondered about my Kentucky roots, but doing this project, I guess, would just say that it helped me expand more. It showed me some new stuff, I guess you could say, and I got to meet some of the people that started it, so it was really interesting for me.
I thought it was unique that we got to actually talk in person with Dan Crary, who is kind of a musical legend and a very important figure in Americana music, as well as Harry Bickle, who, though he's not a celebrity himself, he's like a touchstone, and all of these people knew him. I remember him saying that all of these guys are on his speed dial on his phone. This is kind of amazing. Tony Rice, Sam Bush, Jerry Douglas, J.D. Crowe, Ricky Skaggs. Kind of an amazing collection of celebrities. What did you think, Paul? I think, like Dan said, we get caught in the pop culture of the music that just is right there in your face, and it takes a little bit of extra effort to reach out and discover some other kinds of music that you might be just as interested in, and really as Kentuckians that you ought to be interested in. I want to thank you all for working with me on this project. It was a lot of fun. We learned how to make a movie, and we learned a lot about Kentucky roots history.